Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Friday Business Intelligence Tip. Today, we're going to be talking about how to connect Microsoft Access to Microsoft SQL Server. Now, let me be the first to say I am not a Microsoft Access expert by any stretch of the imagination. I haven't used it in actually a few years, but it happened to come up twice over the past week with two different customers that they wanted to connect their access to our SQL Server data mart. And so I kind of had to walk them through how to do that, which allowed me to reacquaint myself a little bit with Access. So I'm going to show you today a couple different ways of doing it, talk through some of the issues you might run into, and we can go from there. So as a result, I'm going to hop on over here to my other screen. And I opened up a Microsoft Access, just a blank database. So there's nothing in this database that we're going to go to. So what I'm going to do is the very first thing we're going to do to connect to SQL Server is there are two primary ways of doing it. First, we're going to go to the external data method, and we're going to create a new data source. That new data source is coming from a database, and that database is SQL Server. So very straightforward so far that we're doing. Now, when you get to this point, you can either import it directly into the database, and that basically is making a copy of the data that's from SQL Server into Access. I don't recommend you do that because basically you are just taking the data off SQL Server. So in this case, we want to allow SQL Server to do what it does best and house the data and present the data and all of that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to link our Microsoft Access to that data in SQL Server, the second option. And when I say OK, it's going to ask me to create a data source. Now, if I have an ODBC connection already on my machine, I'm good. I'll go through and just create one just because, even though I have some on here. I'll say a new data source, and it's just giving me a little warning there. I'm going to say I'm going to create a user data source. We'll do next. That data source is going to be SQL Server. The SQL Server, we'll say finish. We'll give it a name. I'll just call it test3. And the server, I'll just put in as my laptop here. When I do next, I'm going to go to the next phase here. You can either put in a SQL user ID, which is the second option, or just use your Windows one, which I can do on my laptop because I'm already logged in there. So I'll change my database to be my testing database. There we go. So I've got a testing database. We'll do finish. We'll test it. Test completed successfully. Okay. Okay. We'll test 3. Okay. What that did was it connected in, and it allows me to pick the tables that I want to connect to. Now, there are a couple things here. I'm going to first connect to a table called projects. And if I say OK on projects, it's going to then show me all of the fields in the projects table. Microsoft Access requires me to define a unique key to the table. So there has to be something that defines it as a unique record. Now, this table happens to have one field called unique ID, which is, so I'll just say OK. And when I do that, it will create a link to that projects database. And now if I right click on this, I can open it, and it's going to query that database just like it's, nothing. It ran the query and showed that. So it basically is just using Access as a window into SQL Server. Now, there are a few things you might run into when doing that. And both of these customers ran into it because we happen to be connecting it up to a Infor database. And Infor in their database likes to use periods in some of the column names. Now, Microsoft Access does not like periods or underscores and a few other characters in their column names, and so it won't link successfully. So for instance, if I say I want a new data source here, and I'll say from a database, SQL Server, we'll do everything we did there, except for I'll just select my data source of test3 rather than create that. So if I go over here, find test3, say OK. So I got to the same spot I was before. I'm going to go down to the table that I have called project. I can get up there. My mouse is not cooperating. There we go. So we'll go to the table called project. And if I say okay, it stops me with an error that burden code block.ledger is not a valid name. There's fields in this table that have those special characters in. Access is not going to let you link to those tables like that. So there's a workaround to that you can do. It's a little bit more painful, but in the end of the day, it actually gives you a lot more flexibility to do it this other way. And that is what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to create. And what we're going to do is instead of linking to a table, we're going to create a query. So I'll say query design. And the query we're going to create is called a pass-through query. So if I click where it says pass-through here up on the ribbon bar, it's going to allow me to create a query that's going to pass through to a different source. And that different source, I'm going to go over here to this property sheet. Now, if this property sheet is not displayed, you can turn it on either through the view or up here on the ribbon bar. A lot of times you'll see property sheet by default. So if I display property sheet, and I click on this little button here, it's going to allow me to pick that data source just like I did on the other method with the link table. And I'll pick test 3. And we'll say okay. Now it doesn't allow me to pick a table because really the table that we're picking is going to be a query. So now in this case, you do need to know a little bit of SQL to do this. So I could say something like select star from project. And that would allow me to create a query to actually bring in the whole project table. So if I need to bring in the whole project table, I can do that. That'll bring in the ones with the periods and all into it. Or what I can do is I can take this little dot or little asterisk and say, I want to see, it's like project and description, whatever specific columns that I want. I can put that in here. And if I wanted to test that out to see what it would do, I could say run, and there it is. Or I could go back to the SQL view that's here and say star again and grab them all. So I'll just say star. Oops. So we'll just do star on here. Asterisk if you prefer that terminology. But like when I run that, there's my one row of projects all the way through. So you can do it either way. Now, when you save this, you just give it a new name. I'll call it project. And when I say okay, instead of listing under tables, it'll list under query, but you'll notice the little globe as a pass-through query. So you can access it pretty much the same way either way. Now, those of you that know Access a little more know there are some different things you can do with queries versus tables and so forth. But at the end of the day, for the most part, you can do the same items with either one. So if you need to do anything unique, whether it be filtering out what fields or combining two tables together, you can just issue a pass-through query. And in essence, what that does is that it passes through the query to SQL Server and returns the results. Or you can, if nothing special, you just standard link table and away you go. So that's really all that I wanted to show you today. But if you have anything else you'd like covered in a future event, feel free to reach out to suggestions at dashboardgear.com and or info@dashboardgear.com, that is. And we'll be happy to give that presentation for you. Thanks for joining today and have a great weekend.